IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of All Things Policy. It's been a very eventful week with respect to gender, politics, religion. Last week, we saw the International Women's Day being commemorated. And in India, this week has been extremely tumultuous in some ways because the UP elections seems to have brought up the question of voting patterns amongst women as a block of voters, etc. So yes, a lot of conversations have begun. But coinciding with the International Women's Day, Pew Research brought out a new paper titled How Indians View Gender Roles in Family and Society. Very interesting paper. To discuss this, I'm joined by my colleague Sarthak, and we have with us the team that conducted the study itself, Neha, Sahgal, and Jonathan Evans from Pew. It's been an honor to have you on our show. Welcome. And to hear it straight from the horse to actually man's mouth as such. Hi, Sarthak. Welcome.
Yeah. Hi, Suman. So Neha and Jonathan, welcome to the show. Just for our listeners, can we begin with a quick introduction of yourselves as well as Pew?
Sure, I can begin there. I'm Neha Sahgal. I'm Associate Director of Research at the Pew Research Center. The Pew Research Center is a non-policy, non-partisan research institute. So I know the irony here that this podcast is titled All Things Policy, and yet here we are saying we don't take positions on policy. But part of the reason is we consider ourselves purely a research organization. Our goal is to inform the public debate about key issues, key public policy issues, and to explain how the public feels about these issues. That we feel should be the basis for decision making and for discussion in the policy world.
Yeah, and thank you for having us. I'm Jonathan Evans, and I am a research associate at Pew Research Center. And the team that Neha and I are on, we study religion because it plays a meaningful role in people's lives. And so we also, though, study how religion intersects with other things in people's lives because we know it plays obviously a meaningful role in their outlook.
Great. Thank you for that, Neha and Jonathan. Before we get into actual findings of the survey that you have done and what we can draw out of that, we'd like to know about, the methodology that you had used for this study, just so that our listeners get an idea of the scale, scope of this entire exercise.
Sure, I'm happy to take that. So we prepared for this project over several years, developing a questionnaire and getting everything so that we would be ready to do our fieldwork, our survey in a responsible way that would really get a meaningful representative picture of what Indian society thought on topics related to religion, national identity, and gender. And so in the end, our survey was about a 45-minute survey covering those topics. We were able to interview about 30,000 Indians from 29 states and union territories. And the interviews happened from the tail end of 2019 through the first few months of 2020. We had to end things just a little bit early due to the first wave of COVID-19. But we got to nearly every state and union territory that we had hoped to. We conducted interviews in 17 languages because we want people to be able to talk about these issues and these topics in the language and in the framing that is most comfortable and natural to them so we can get truly what they think on these topics.
So training of these, surveyors must be a big thing, right? For you. I mean, what goes into training these people to get to elicit the right response?
Yeah, there's a several days worth of training, both in a classroom setting as well as sort of boots on the ground practice. So not only do we walk through in detail the questionnaire so that they are comfortable reading all of the questions and they don't trip up while they're saying it because they've had lots of practice, but we also walk them through like how they should go about picking which house to go to, because we don't just say like, oh, go pick 10 houses in this neighborhood. They have to follow a very measured procedure so that it's a random sample. And so we teach them, the procedure to go through. You knock at this door and then you count this many doors and you knock at that door, so that it is a scientifically sound method. And then they get to go out in teams to practice it for a day or two to make sure that they don't have any questions and they can get real world experience on it. And then we begin the main project. And for that, they went out in teams of 3. There were 2 interviewers and 1 supervisor who would travel to each neighborhood or village, and they would conduct all the interviews in that spot before moving to another location.
Wow.
I will add that survey research in India is fairly prolific. There's the National Family Health Survey, which is very well known. And actually, when we conducted our survey, a number of our interviewers that we had recruited had actually previously worked for the National Family Health Survey.
Oh, yeah.
That had been in the field right before us. So, and the sampling methodology and the procedure there are some differences, but there's a lot of similarities. So there's a lot of talent in India for doing this kind of work and a lot of technical expertise as well.
Yeah. So, since Neha, you're talking about the National Family Health Survey, or again, there are other kind of surveys as well. The things that they measure over there and the things that you are trying to measure might be slightly different, right? So, I was wondering whether there was a consistent interpretation of meanings of certain terms. You have used terms like discrimination, rights. These are all part of the questions, right? For example, whether women face discrimination or should women have rights. Now, all these terms might be interpreted differently by different people, right? So, how did you ensure that all the respondents have a same baseline understanding of these terms? And if the baseline is not the same, let's say, and in that case, how did you interpret the findings across various groups?
That's an excellent question, and one that we certainly give a lot of thought to in questionnaire development. One thing that becomes really important anytime anybody is doing an attitudinal survey, or really any survey, is the testing procedure. So we would typically do multiple levels of testing. And for this particular study, because of the subject matter being a little more difficult, we actually invested quite a bit of time in testing. So we will typically pre-test a survey where we'll go through the interview with a test respondent, see where there are any hiccups. Then we'll also do a method known as cognitive testing, where we will ask the respondent a question, and we'll pick many different respondents to do this, one from the north, one from the south, different languages. And then we'll ask them to explain to us what they understood by the question and why they answered the way they did. And basically what we're looking for is exactly what you talked about, Sarthak. Are we seeing that people are understanding the question as what we meant for it to ask, right? Are there any differences that we should really be mindful of? And based on that, we often have to tweak the questions. We often have to maybe pick a term that is easier to understand, that will have a baseline that'll be more easily achieved. And then once we're done with the cognitive testing, then we'll do, for this study, we also did a regional test in 4 states. We did a pilot study of several thousand interviews that was also designed to test out some of the questions, as well as test out the procedures for asking the questions. But even with all of this in mind, survey research is still part art and part science, because you are dealing with human subjects, and it is still possible that people may have varying interpretations of something like discrimination, right? And that may influence the results. So how can we kind of examine post hoc, right, these varying interpretations? Well, one way to do that is to take a look at the answers to the question based on several demographic cuts. Take a look at the answers regionally, take a look at it by age groups, men and women, different languages, and see what differences you see. And that can become part of explaining the findings. So in the question about discrimination, the southern states showed more concern, or were more likely, people in the southern states were more likely to say there's a lot of discrimination against women than those in the northern states. That's a really interesting finding, right? Because, we do know that just in terms of crime and statistics about crime, it's a lot more prevalent in the north. We also know that women in the south have better demographic outcomes, more education, etc. So then why is it that people in the southern states were more likely to see discrimination against women? And that is where I think some of our interpretations of the data can come in. Could it be that there is more awareness of this issue in the south? Or could it be that the southern states are reflecting on what's going on in the rest of the country? I should mention that in the southern states, people also saw more caste discrimination. And could it be that these issues are just more in the public eye and more in the public discussion in the south than it is in the north? So that's a way of explaining. There are processes we can put in place to account for varying interpretations. Still, this is part art, part science, and in our interpretation of the results, we should keep the context in mind.
Yeah, thanks, Neha, for this. So this was about interpretation, but in some cases, it might so happen that the respondents respond in a way so that they seem more acceptable, right? There are some questions like, should there be balance between the number of sons and daughters in a family? Or another question, right? Should women have rights? So in these kind of questions, the respondents might answer in a way so that they seem, their answer seems more acceptable. There can be a possibility of social desirability bias. So did you also account for that?
Yeah, that's very common in surveys, particularly on a subject such as this, social desirability bias, where the respondent is basically giving an answer that they think will make them look good to the interviewer or in a way that they want to be seen. So social desirability is, it's an interesting concept, because in some ways, if these are people's publicly stated opinions, right? And even if for the respondent, they are giving a response based on what they think is the appropriate answer, that's still very meaningful to them. So one example I like to give is in the US, people tend to exaggerate the level at which they attend religious services or they go to church, right? If you ask them how often they go, they tend to exaggerate a little bit. That itself is a meaningful data point that people in the US feel the need to say, I'm the kind of person that goes to church, right? That's still a meaningful answer that they're giving us. Can we account for social desirability bias? Absolutely. We can design questions such that they make respondents more comfortable. So for example, in the question about sex-selective abortion, that one is a very carefully designed question. We originally tested that question as, in a more direct way, asking people if aborting a female fetus or a fetus based on the sex of the baby is okay. That elicited, when we tested it out, we felt, that people are not comfortable answering that question. So we worded that question to make people more comfortable. Like, is it acceptable that you balance the number of girls and boys in a family by using a modern intervention? Like, we don't, we're kind of dancing around the issue, but it's for a reason.
You're not using the words that put people off, right?
Exactly. And what you do see in the results is a lot of variation in the data, and that's just kind of a wonky way of saying, like, if 90% of people had said that that's completely unacceptable, I would say, oh, wow, okay, there's something going on here, because we know the sex ratio in India is imbalanced. So how can 90% of people say that this is completely unacceptable? Instead, we find that for about 40% of Indians, this is either completely acceptable or it's at least acceptable under some circumstances. So these are people's publicly stated opinions. It is possible that we are slightly understating the share of people who say that this is acceptable. Still, it's far from a negligible number, and it does show variation across states, right? You do see some states it's much higher, and some states it's much lower. So we can use the public attitudes in the variation in the public attitudes to understand better about the correlates or the demographic factors that are associated with seeing sex-selective abortion as acceptable. Jonathan, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think that covers it. The only maybe thing to add is we also, when we asked the question initially, something that people did very frequently bring up in our our tested version was they would very quickly bring up, oh, this is an illegal practice. And like they would talk about penalties for it or those sorts of things. And so that was another reason to draw away from the very direct, should we end a pregnancy based on the sex of the fetus, to this more euphemistic form, was so that people's thought truly was on their attitude about the practice and the topic, not so much instantly thinking about penalties or, something being illegal, but truly more of their attitude.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for those insights on the methodology itself. So it really gives a fair idea about how rigorous the whole study is. I think it's remarkable that you guys have done such a detailed and rigorous study on this thing. We'll take a short break here. Once we come back, we'll discuss main findings and anything else that come up during that conversation. Yep. Short break. We'll be back.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On All Things Policy, the hosts talk about India approving a fourth COVID-19 vaccine. This time is for children, and they discuss some of the challenges that are involved when you're doing clinical trials for kids. On the Filter Coffee Podcast, Karthik is joined by Amar Singh Patra, Managing Director of Spotify India, to talk about how Spotify's growth approach was different for India in comparison to other countries. On the Paisa Vaisa Podcast, Anupam Gupta is in conversation with Praveen Jadhav, founder and CEO at Dhan. They discuss how stock trading has evolved over the last 10 years. On the Edges and Sledges Cricket Podcast, Varun and Ashwin dive into the first 3 matches by Team India in the Women's ODI World Cup. They also chat with Mr. Atul Srivastava, founder of SmartCricket.com, about player management. And the Simplified Gang gets into a group discussion about MBA ambitions. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Also, don't forget to rate us on any platform that you might be listening to us. You can also check us out on YouTube. We have a webpage, ivmpodcast.com/YouTube, where a list of all our channels are. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, SBI Life Insurance, Bank of Baroda, India Water Portal, and Max Life Insurance. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Welcome back, everybody. Before we move on to the next part of the podcast, we'd like to remind all our listeners that the admissions for the next cohort of the Graduate Certificate of Public Policy is open now. You can log in to school.takshashila.org.in to file in your applications. We look forward to getting a lot of you to come and study public policy with us. Yeah? So head on over and make that application soon. Yeah. So coming back, Neha, Jonathan, what would you put in as 5 main takeaways from the study?
At this point, I'm going to let Jonathan go first so I can think more about the facts.
Sure, I can lead off with 1 or 2 and get us started. I think if people were to walk away with one thing from the study, I would hope that they would walk away understanding the contrasting attitudes on gender. That on the one hand, we see that most Indians say that women and men make equally good political leaders. Even more than 1 in 10 feel that women generally make better political leaders than men. Yet at the same time, we see in domestic settings that about 9 in 10 Indians agree with the notion that a wife must always obey her husband. And the fact that this contrast can be seen outside of the survey data too. Of course, India is one of the first countries in the world to elect a woman as prime minister, and Indira Gandhi leads the country for quite some time. At the same time, as Neha mentioned earlier, the sex ratio at birth in India has been among the most skewed towards males in the world for quite some time. So I think if people could take away the fact that there are contrasting attitudes, and that it really does come down to topic and situation specific instances, that would be something I'd really want people to take away from this.
Sure, thanks. When you say obey, again, I'm like a little confused about the interpretation of it. It could mean different things to different people.
For sure, it could mean different things to different people. And something that we do when we conduct surveys is we try as little as possible actually to define the terms for people, because we want them to use it through their own lens. So we did not, give it a long definition of obey or use lots of words. We simply asked, how much do you agree with the following statement. And this was one of the ones that was read, that a wife must always obey her husband. And so we do see that both men and women in fairly large shares do agree with this term. This wasn't just driven, say, by men saying this, that both men and women agreed with that statement.
It's a very strongly worded statement. It's a wife must always obey her husband. So in some sense, it's a very absolute kind of statement. And this one we've actually asked in many other countries as well. And we do tend to see that, the data varies a lot. We've asked in predominantly Muslim countries in the Middle East, as well as in Southeast Asia, the same question. We found a pretty similar result where generally people tended to agree with this statement. In more gender conservative countries, more people agreed with the statement, and there weren't too many differences between men and women.
Sure. That's an interesting insight. I mean, any other findings? I mean, you could talk about a few more findings that you found interesting or some kind of takeaways from there.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add on to thank you, Jonathan, for getting this started. And it's always you have the BuzzFeed list of the top 5, so it's good. And so I always put Jonathan before me for difficult questions. That's the trend. All right. Well, for me, I think what's clear in the data is the son preference continues to be part of Indian life. We asked people how important it is in a family to have at least one son. How important is it to have at least one daughter? And in both cases, people felt that having a son as well as having a daughter is very important. And that points to, once again, the fact that Indians do consider gender balance among children to be a salient issue to them. And in part, this sense for gender balance or having at least one son may come from the view that's still a majority view in Indian society that the last rites must be conducted by a son. The majority of Indians agree that the last rites should be the responsibility of the son and not that of the daughter. And that really potentially plays into this, although when it comes to inheritance and who should have more rights to an inheritance, who should care for aging parents, there you see, I mean, most people say both sons and daughters should be involved with taking care of aging parents, or both sons and daughters should have equal rights to inheritance. Of course, there's still a substantial share who do say that this should be the prerogative of the son. And so stemming from that, there does seem to be among a significant segment of the population an acceptance that it is okay to intervene to balance the number of girls and boys in a family. So all of that kind of all together, seeing women as largely, I mean, men as the more dominant role, right? A very important dominant role in a family when it comes to wife obeying husband or sons being responsible for last rites. Very important to have a son in the family, okay to balance gender in the family. All of that together does point to still pervasive son preference in Indian society.
So, I just wanted to ask one thing. So, all these findings about preference for maybe a male child, we also have empirical evidence for that, right? So, there is some evidence literature on that. Now, I just wanted to move to the other end. So, did you come across anything which was surprising, right? Empirical evidence has been suggesting something else, but when you did the research, you found something which is kind of diametrically opposite to that. Something which is interesting, surprising.
I can get it started then, and I think there's quite a bit to unpack here, so maybe Jonathan can chime in as well. I mean, one thing we are seeing in India from the from the data that's coming especially about sex-selective abortion and the gender ratio, there are some important and significant changes underway in India, in Indian demographics. And these changes are occurring in a very short period of time, unusually short period of time, I would say. Sometimes, I like to say that demographic change is sort of a drama in slow motion. But here, it's not slow motion. It's happening pretty fast. The Indian fertility rate has gone down faster than expected. And some of the states that had the most skewed sex ratios, like Punjab, for example, are the most recent National Family Health Survey data is showing change and very quick change. So the next census will offer more definitive evidence for this, but it does seem like Punjab's sex ratio went from being really heavily skewed to now being a lot less skewed in a very short amount of time, right? Just a matter of 5-6 years in between. This is a very major change. So we are seeing the public attitudes in Punjab toward sex-selective abortion, as well as other issues, being more liberal than other northern states, or less gender conservative than other northern states, and that could be indicative of the fact that there's a lot of change happening in this state, as well as perhaps a couple other northern states. But I think Punjab is most notable. Jonathan?
Yeah, something else that I think is discussed a lot has been the fact that women in India's south, we've mentioned this a little earlier, tend to have better socioeconomic outcomes, things like greater odds of going to receive college education or longer life expectancy on average than do women elsewhere in the country. But something we find in the data is that Southern attitudes toward gender roles, towards the role in the home or in society more generally, they're not necessarily more egalitarian in the South than in the North. It really depends on the issue. And what's more significant often than the variation between, say, Hindi Belt and South is actually the variation within the region. So within the South, people in Karnataka often express much more traditional views on the family roles that women and men should play than people do in Kerala, for example. So I think that's also something that will be of interest to readers.
And that's actually something I grew up in India. I spent my formative years in India, and I was nearly always told, I grew up in the North, that the South, women are so much more free. In the South, it's very different. Gender attitudes are different. But when I looked at this data, and I looked at National Family Health Survey as well, I sort of came to the realization that when we say this in the South, things are better for women, or public attitudes toward women are more liberal, maybe what we're really talking about is Kerala. Right?
Yeah.
And the other southern states,
to a small extent, Tamil Nadu.
Maybe, and to some extent Tamil Nadu, but Kerala most consistently stands out as the southern state where gender attitudes are a lot less traditional, a lot less conservative than other states. To some extent, Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka not at all. Right? Karnataka resembles many northern states, or it's actually even more conservative than many northern states. So that, to me, even as somebody who grew up in India, like, it was sort of a aha realization.
Yeah,
there were some findings where Karnataka and UP, the response rates were more or less same.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yes.
For someone who has grown up in Karnataka and who lives still in Bangalore, it just hurts. Like, I can't even say. Yeah. So, is there anything else you would want to discuss as findings? I mean, something that you can throw light on.
Yeah, I mean, one thing this study can also do for us is put India in the global context, because Pew Research Center does work in India, it does work in other countries as well. And, the results there are not entirely unexpected. I mean, Indians are at par with many other countries in the world in supporting equal rights for women. Here, Sarthak, your earlier question, it's such a like a gimme question, like, do you support equal rights for women? Like, who says no to that? But people do, right? So you have about 70% of Indians supporting, saying that it's very important and women and men have equal rights, which is about the same as what you see in some other countries. But when it comes to attitudes toward the gender roles in a family, Indians do rank much higher on the conservative scale, or tend to express more conservative views than what we see in most other countries. I believe for the question about what kind of marriage is more satisfying, one where the husband works and the wife takes care of household and children, India ranked like second out of some 30-some countries where we had surveyed, for saying that a traditional marriage where women stay at home and the husband provides is preferable. I think only Tunisia ranked higher than India, preferring the traditional gender roles. So, here again, Sarthak, to your earlier question about social desirability, one of the things about it is that it affects everybody, right? No matter what country we survey in. Still, even taking that into account, we still see that Indians express more conservative gender attitudes than what we see in other countries.
Yeah, I mean, comparatively, we can make that judgment, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So do you think like factors like education or just the extent of education affect responses or just their attitudes towards gender roles?
Jonathan,
Yeah,
you want to
I can jump in on this one. So with education, we do find that that is one of the strongest markers for differentiating how people respond to these questions. That people with a college degree are less likely than other Indians to support conservative or more traditional gender norms in the home, and much less influential is people's age or if they're a man or a woman. We do find that men and older adults, those who are 35 and older, they tend to be slightly more likely to take a traditional view than, say, younger adults or women. But it really is slight. On some questions, it was a matter of, 1 or 2 points more likely. So it's not a big weight. You wouldn't describe it differently if you were talking about it to your friend on the street, even though it is a few points, that men are more likely to say a traditional viewpoint. Another marker for difference, we did find that different religious communities tend to have different stances on some of these gender roles. So probably the biggest distinction is that Muslim members of the Muslim community tend to take the most traditional view towards gender roles in families, while Sikhs are at the other end of the spectrum, that they are the least likely community to hold these traditional gender views. And
Interesting.
in part, that could be the fact that, a little bit from the fact that Muslims are slightly less likely to have a college education. So that could play some role. But even when we look
Economic
at
role, economic situation also.
potentially, yes, we did look into like education. We looked at just people who have a college education, and we still find, though, that Muslims who have a college degree are still more traditional in their views on these topics than are Sikhs who have a college degree. So it's something beyond simply just education that the data shows.
Okay.
Yeah. So, Jonathan, since you're talking about how religion and views can vary, right? So, one thing I also observe is some of the respondents are from the scheduled caste community, and some of the respondents are from the scheduled tribe communities, right? They're also, I mean, so, but if I look at the data, you have clubbed scheduled caste and scheduled tribe together. Now, is there any specific reason why the data has been clubbed together? I'm asking this because some of the empirical evidence suggests that maybe scheduled tribes might be more egalitarian if you look at the sex ratio and other things. Right. So I would assume that maybe their perception about gender roles might be different from scheduled caste perception about gender roles. So is there any specific reason why you have clubbed the data together?
Yeah, this is actually something that we did look into, and we find that on some topics, yes, there is a difference between scheduled caste and scheduled tribe, and on those cases, in those tables and in those discussions, we did break them apart. But by and large, a lot of the questions that we asked, people in scheduled castes and scheduled tribes did not give markedly different answers. And so we did keep them together as a comparison point to general caste communities.
Sure. Thanks, Jonathan, for that clarification. Are there some closing comments? Do you want to summarize the whole thing in just about few
who wants
sentences?
to go
Sure.
first?
Yeah, I could go first. Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, I think that if I had to summarize the whole thing, I would say that there are strong opinions in very different directions, depending on the topic we ask about. That, for example, Indians do accept women as political leaders. Indians do say that men and women should have equal rights. At the same time, we see traditional gender roles in family life as being a priority for many people. We also see that there's a preference for wives obeying husbands in the home. So I think to treat this as a monolith topic does a disservice, that we need to look at specific issues to really understand what is going on when we talk about gender roles in India.
I'm not the first person to ever say that India is a land of contradictions, but I think the contradiction, over and over again, the more you study India, the more you realize that which is true.
Every one data point you get out of India, the opposite is also true. That
Exactly.
is
also true. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think once again, we are humbled by the data and what we see in India. I mean, when, people ask me about my experiences growing up in India, and especially in the US, they read the news and they keep asking me about that. And I, nearly always say, like, look, this is the country that elected it was one of the first countries to elect a prime minister who's a woman. And then you have major political parties that are led by women. You have, and some that are currently in opposition to the main ruling government. And Indians don't bat an eyelid. And they don't think that that's unusual at all. And that was always my sense. And now that was borne out by the data, where a majority of Indians say that women and men make equally good political leaders. And in fact, some people even felt women make better political leaders than men. So, you have, but at the same time, you have this pervasive son preference, and, in Indian context. And so the two are in such contrast, right? And we are so humbled once again, right, by describing India in a sentence that's virtually impossible, because what part, other than to say that it's a land of great contradiction, and and the data has clearly once again borne that out.
Yeah, the other interesting paradox here is, like, while we have elected the first woman prime minister, and we've had a lot of leaders as women, the representation is still a cause of concern, which probably points to something else that says that in daily life, we are not doing enough for representation. But when they do show up, we are okay with that. We are happy to have women leaders or whatever. I don't know how to read that part, but contrasting representation in political life versus just these leaders and, the few stray leaders that we have is a little confusing for me.
Suman, that's actually a very, very interesting observation. In a sense, it's sort of like all or nothing, right? That we're seeing in the data too, and very little middle ground. So you're either representing your country at the highest office, or you're obeying your husband. Always, right? You must always, or you're obeying your husband, or you're leading a country, right? To two wars and emergency and God knows what all, right? But what about the middle? Right? So, because the contradictions are so severe, like that is and that is what we see in the data. You're either one or the other. Like, what about everybody else in the middle? What are their lives?
Middle.
Right. Maybe the missing middle, or maybe the missing moderate opinion in the middle. That is what we're missing.
Yeah, true. Thank you so much, Neha. Thank you, Jonathan, for being on the show. There is a lot of literature that's coming out about all the attitudes Indians have, and what you have done at Pew is actually adding to that wealth of knowledge. And I'm sure, it will point us to the right direction. So we are extremely grateful for this body of research. And I hope, you do more of this so that we get to a better place. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you. It's been our pleasure.
Thanks, Neha. Thanks, Jonathan. And thanks to our listeners. And I would request our listeners to go through their findings. The link for the findings we'll be sharing along with this podcast. So please go through the website and look at how Indians view gender roles.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
A wise man once said, traveling It makes you speechless, then turns you into a storyteller.
Well, listen to such travel stories and experiences exploring India on the Musafir Stories with us, Saif and Faiza.
Catch us on the IVM website, app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.
Are you looking for finance products and services that can enhance your personal finance experience? Are you looking for a space to talk about your financial product or service? And are you looking for a crisp talk show where the conversation is all about money? Well, your search ends here. Hi, my name is Anupam Gupta and I'm host of the Paisa Vaisa podcast, and I invite you for the conversation about your personal finance on each Monday on the IVM podcast app or the website or on any podcast streaming platforms. See you folks.